presidential power and impeachment. Seemingly every president since President Clinton has had the threat of impeachment when they overstep their presidential power. But what is impeachment? What does it entail? And exactly for what can the president be impeached? Continuing our conversation on executive power from last week, Dr. Adam Carrington of Hillsdale College will join us again to discuss those questions and more. All of that is coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Last week, we began an incredibly important conversation on the topic of executive power. And while the conversation today largely centers around the notion of President Trump's recent declaration of a national emergency, it seems that every president since President Clinton has faced the threat of impeachment. But what is impeachment, and what actually constitutes an impeachment process, and for what can the president be impeached? Joining me for that conversation again is Dr. Adam Carrington, Assistant Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College. Dr. Carrington, welcome back. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Glad to be here again. Thanks for letting me come back.
You're always welcome here at Face the Issues. Last week, we started this conversation about executive power, and specifically in the news right now, we talked about the president's declaration of a national emergency. We talked about past presidents and executive orders and so forth. But one of the things that has consistently come up is this idea of impeachment. And it seems like every president since President Clinton has been at least threatened with impeachment, or there's been protests that surround impeachment. And we'll get into the details of impeachment, but let me start by asking you this. Impeachment is the responsibility of the Congress, but it deals with the president. Can you kind of give us a 30,000-foot overview of where these responsibilities and roles lie with the different branches?
Right. And the question is how, if there is misconduct, and we'll talk, I know later a little bit about what kind, how do you discipline and keep out corruption or other problems related to the fact that sometimes people who hold office will not be up to that office by moral or ethical or even legal standards. And the idea was to give Congress the power of impeachment. It existed before the U.S. Constitution in previous governments in the past, and it is the power to accuse the president and to remove him from office. And what's interesting is it very much, we'll talk later, looks like a judicial process. It is very judicial in kind of charging a president and then holding a trial and convicting him. And the interesting thing is it in some ways violates the separation of powers, but it's intentional. It's an intentional exception whereby the idea is if you're going to take such a monumental move as to remove a sitting president of the United States, then the people's representatives should be tasked with making that decision as a kind of prosecutors and jury in an exception to what the normal ways of going. It just shows that it's such an extraordinary move that it doesn't follow the normal rules of legislative, executive, and judicial power.
Sure. And so that's why the judiciary doesn't have a say in the impeachment.
No, all that can happen is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will sit in and be the judge while the Senate sits as basically a jury to decide whether to convict or not convict based on charges from the House. So that's the only part the judiciary plays. Every other part of it is played by the House and Senate.
Sure. Let me ask you this. Obviously, when we talk about impeachment, we talk about the president. Are there other offices that can be impeached? I know there's those who want to impeach Supreme Court justices and so forth. Are there other offices that can also be impeached?
Yes, even though the presidency is the one that's the most talked about because it's in some ways, most consequential of the list. But there have been federal judges that have been impeached. A Supreme Court judge was almost removed from office back in 1804. And often, and as recently as I believe it was 2012, a district judge was, it's possible for cabinet officials and others in the executive branch to be impeached as well. And the process is the same, even though we often focus on the presidency, with a similar idea. To remove someone in that way is an extraordinary remedy. And therefore, because of its extraordinary nature, it's given to the people's representatives to do so.
And to follow up on that, when we leave the realm of the federal government and we get into the way states operate, some states have impeachment written to their constitutions, others don't. Some states have recall elections. This is how we got Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in California. As we know, Governor Scott Walker survived the recall election in Wisconsin. And then cities and municipalities do it differently as well. Where our studios are located, we just went through a situation where the mayor of one of our major cities was removed, was forcibly removed. He was convicted, tried by U.S. prosecutors, and convicted on multiple counts of fraud, government fraud. But there wasn't an impeachment process in the city's bylaws by which the council could have removed him. They could vote no confidence but not remove him. Could you explain a little bit about why from state to state and municipality to municipality it's different? Because I think a lot of people, a lot of our viewers, a lot of constituents have this mindset that impeachment is something across the board in every government form in the country.
Yes, and certainly state and local governments have freedom to, within certain restrictions of the Constitution, set up how they want to structure their government as they wish. There's some restrictions, but part of federalism is that they have a lot of leeway. And I think at least for those who have some way of removal, the difference between, say, a recall and an impeachment is twofold. One is where they originate. Impeachment existed during the Constitution. It was created before the Constitution. It was put in there by the Constitution at the federal level and was mimicked by a number of states. The recall and similar ideas to that actually arise more in the progressive era. And the difference is that impeachment is normally attached to some kind of wrongdoing. That is where an official has done something that the public didn't know about, that they would not have elected him or her otherwise, that is unethical or illegal. There's some debate about how far it has to go. A recall is much broader. A recall could just be, I don't like the policy decisions, and I don't believe, based on consent of the governed, the people should have to wait all the way till the next election to voice their disgust and their desire not to have that official in. And so there could be no wrongdoing ethically or legally, and you could be recalled, whereas an impeachment, at least according to the general understanding of it, involves some kind of actual malicious wrongdoing.
That's an important distinction that you just made there. And I think, at least from where I sit, we hear a lot about impeachment. Like I said, President Clinton was the last president impeached. And it seems like President Bush had people that want him impeached. President Obama had people that want him impeached. President Trump has people that want him impeached. And I am sure this is going to continue. A lot of those reasons that, at least that I hear, seem to be policy disagreements. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's become weaponized in a way that it wasn't before. And not that we didn't have, there was the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, there was the near impeachment of Richard Nixon before he resigned. But I think what you've really started to see in how bitter and partisan our politics has become, that impeachment has started to be used as a way to get someone out because of policy disagreements, looking for other ways because either the opposition didn't win an election or because they're angry at how the president has done his job since he was elected. Yes, I think that often underneath this is a deep frustration with policy outcomes and the partisanship and a tool to try to undermine political opposition, which of course it was ultimately not meant to do.
Sure.
But I think that in many ways our politics has gotten to where we weaponize about anything we can, and this is left and right. And I think that is showing in the fact that impeachment is so often at least threatened.
Sure. And let me follow up on that point. To your point, a lot of this seems to be weaponized by our politics and by our rhetoric today. And perhaps, I mean, there are arguments for and against whether or not something the president does is an impeachable offense. But how normally does the Congress, I mean, because the Congress and the president having disagreements is not something that just occurred in the last few decades. This goes far, far, far back since the founding of our Congress. How traditionally have the two dealt with those disagreements? Because unless they've always just called for impeachment, which...
No, they have not, even though, and I think the underlying problem would be we rejected a plan at the Constitutional Convention to have Congress pick the president. Because the idea is he was one of the framers at that convention said he would become a creature of the legislature. He would be controlled by Congress. And this could be a backdoor way of making that happen if the threats of impeachment actually became realities of impeachment. And I think that the way that it's supposed to be done is by the exercise of legislative and executive powers as given by the Constitution. So how does Congress fight presidential policy or overreach or other problems that fall short of impeachment? Well, they ultimately have the power of the purse. Government can't run without money. Who allocates the money? The legislature, the Congress, by giving it out. Who exercises oversight to say whether their money is being spent the way they intended it? Congress does. And on the same side, the executive has the power to veto. He has some leeway in how he carries out laws. And those are the normal mechanisms, and those can get quite nasty. I think that the system allows for partisanship. The system in some ways demands partisanship as a way of figuring out policy goals. But those were the actual normal techniques that were set up for the branches to figure out when there's disagreement how to do so, ultimately culminating in elections that as both sides make their point for what the law should be, the voters then go to the polls if they're given a clear choice and then eventually vote in a Congress and a president that can agree at least on the things that they're most committed to.
Sure. So elections do have consequences.
They should.
They should.
Yes.
So great. Dr. Carrington, thank you. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Dr. Carrington, thank you again for your time. When we left off, we were talking about impeachment and specifically the roles that each branch of government has. And almost back to what you said last week, where if branches of government are punting their responsibility or trying to take someone else's responsibility, we end up in a bit of a mess. And a lot of times, or in this situation, impeachment almost reflects that, this call to get rid of someone that we disagree with. Well, let me start with this. A lot of the calls since President Clinton was impeached, there were those who wanted President Bush impeached for the Iraq War. They believed that we went in under false pretenses, and they found that to be an impeachable offense. There are those that felt that President Obama should be impeached for what seems like a litany of reasons, but including his invasion of Libya, his executive order on immigration. And then there are those who think that President Trump should be impeached. Predominantly, you hear about the Russian collusion situation. The Cohen hearings have happened right around this time as we're taping. And then now the declaration of a national emergency. In your mind, are any of those actual impeachable offenses?
I think the question that you have to ask is, what is a high crime and misdemeanor? That's the language that the Constitution uses, that a president or other officials can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. And I think that at least some of the things on that list, if they are as described, and I think that's one of the big problems, might be impeachable. If the president recklessly or carelessly lied to the American people, or lied under oath, and I think that could bring up both Clinton and President Bush. If you could really prove malicious, malicious intentional action on that caused the deaths of people or that flaunted the law, I think there is at least some argument that could be possible. I think
Sure.
what ends up happening is these often get really overstated, because I think what you really have to have for a high crime and misdemeanor, and there's lots of debate about what a high crime and misdemeanor is. We don't have a ton of founding evidence for it, but a high crime at least seems different than a crime.
Sure.
And I think what the American people ultimately have to ask on some of these things is, what's the difference between something that can be settled by a future election or by a curtailing of presidential power by Congress, and what is so bad, what is so overtly destructive of the Constitution, destructive of the American government, destructive to the American people, that it deserves to be completely thrown out. And that's why you often see such superlative language when these things are being described, because they understand that it can't just be a policy disagreement. It can't just be a mistake in judgment. It has to be something that is truly on the level of almost catastrophic to our republic.
Sure. So President Clinton's impeachment, he was not impeached for having a relationship with the intern, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
He was charged officially with with perjury, lying under oath. He was charged with obstruction of justice and actual crimes. Now, the debate was not so much whether he did so, although there was some debate on that. It was really a question of, were they high crimes and misdemeanors, and did that rise to the level of impeachment? So that's what he was. It was not for questions of sexual ethics, even though that led to those kinds of questions. It was the question of actual crimes against statutes passed by Congress.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important distinction, to the point that you had brought up last week, the idea that this can't just be a policy disagreement or a personal disagreement, or I don't like someone's morals. It really needs to come back again to what the Constitution says, and to your point, the question of what is a high crime, and do the actions rise to that?
Right. And again, it's frustrating because we don't have a long discussion, say at the Constitutional Convention or other places, while they were trying to figure out what this term means. So ultimately, the term is interpreted partly by its text. Like I said, there's a difference between a crime and a high crime. They wouldn't use the modifier. But at the same time, it ultimately also is what the people and the people's representatives believe rises to that level. And therefore, when there is a real discussion of it, it needs to be something where the American people have to interject. They have to say what they think is something that is regime level shattering versus something that can be handled in the other ways we've already discussed.
Sure. Let me ask you about the impeachment process itself. Earlier you mentioned this is like a trial, but it's held by the legislative branches. Can you walk us through briefly what that process looks like?
Right. And by the way, if anyone is listening from West Virginia, they just went through a process kind of like that for their Supreme Court.
That's right.
But I'll say that the process for the U.S. government is the House of Representatives acts as sort of a grand jury. They're the ones that draw up accusations and vote by a majority on whether those accusations should become formal charges. And that's what it actually means to be impeached, is to be formally charged by the House. If articles of impeachment cross that barrier, if they actually get approved by the House, and the last time that happened was with President Clinton, they then go over to the Senate. And the way it has been set up is that generally members of the House act as prosecutors, and the president is allowed to have lawyers or persons represent him on his side, and the Senate sits as basically a large jury. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court acts as the judge. the jury, the Senate, hears all the evidence presented against and for the president, and there's all these rules that have been set up, not constitutionally, but by the Senate for rules of evidence and things like that. But then ultimately the Senate votes, and if 2/3 of the Senate, not a majority, but if 2/3 agree that these articles are worthy of conviction, then the president would be removed from office. And by the way, just removed from office. It has nothing to do with criminal liability. That's a completely separate issue. It's a mere question of whether he remains in office or not.
Okay. And so impeachment is not removal, and removal doesn't come with a prison sentence or anything like that.
And there still is the culpability. A prosecutor could charge a president with actual crimes after leaving office, but impeachment is merely left to whether one can remain in office or not, which, by the way, the founders recognized would be very powerful. Some people would find the besmirching of their honor by being removed from office as bad or worse an attack on their reputation, character, and life than even a prison sentence. They recognized how powerful someone who gets to the office of president, how powerful ambition and reputation can be for them.
Sure. We said earlier, a lot of calls for impeachment that come over and over and over again. A number of House Democrats have filed impeachment bills since the Democrat Party took over the House. Speaker Pelosi has not brought a single one to the floor, stating that she doesn't believe this is appropriate at the time. This is kind of the tension that often happens in a party that is trying to impeach the president, where there are those that are actively pursuing it, and then leadership, in this case Speaker Pelosi, just doesn't believe it's a good idea or doesn't believe that it merits impeachment. The consistent and insistent calls for impeachment every time something happens that we disagree with, do you find this to be damaging to democracy or to our discourse at all, or is this something that's just kind of riffraff that you think blows over?
I think it's damaging in a minor sense as long as it's merely talk. And the minor sense is just it shows a desire to go outside the normal channels to achieve policy outcomes and to achieve winning of elections or outcomes that should be from elections. If we start to regularly actually impeach presidents, I think, even if we don't convict them, I think that's where it could get much more damaging. And we'll have to see. I know the Democratic leadership has been fairly cool on the question of impeachment. I think they're waiting for the Mueller Report if it ever becomes public. They're waiting on the Southern District of New York and what they might find. And it's going to be a real question when that comes out. And a lot of the question is going to be how the American people react to these accusations. But it should not be the norm. If it's the norm, either we're weaponizing it, like I said before, or we are electing such corrupt politicians that the ability to run a rule of law, ethical government has been fatally or at least chronically undermined. One of those two is the option, and neither is a good one.
And so isn't what Speaker Pelosi is doing now, which is not bringing these votes or these bills to a vote, waiting on it, saying, hey, look, if there's something here that is impeachable, let's actually wait for the report to come in. Is that, in your opinion, as a constitutional scholar, would that be the right approach to do it then if you're in leadership?
I think it's really presumptive to assume that there's an impeachable offense that's going to come out of an investigation that isn't over. I think that's getting very presumptive, and I think that's right. And I think she's thinking also politically, impeachment didn't go great for the Republicans when they impeached President Clinton. It was not popular. It was not liked. And President Clinton was more popular than President Trump. But I think also the American people, there's sort of a threshold they think it needs to be crossed before they think this is the kind of option, which they weren't ever really completely convinced with Clinton. So I think it's wise of the speaker to say, I don't know what they're going to find, and we shouldn't do anything one way or another till we know. And I think that is actually a wise thing that the speaker has done and should continue to do until they know a lot more than they have now.
Great. Well, Dr. Carrington, thank you so much. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. One programming note, we do tape this before it airs. And as Dr. Carrington and I have been talking about impeachment, and we make mention of the Mueller investigation and the forthcoming Mueller report, it is certainly possible by the time you're watching this that report has been released, at least to the Congress. And we obviously don't know what is contained in that report. And so our conversation today could alter depending on that report's release. And at that point, Dr. Carrington, we'd love to have you back and we could talk more about whether or not this rises to the level of a high crime misdemeanor.
Right. Well, I hope we get to see it because, as you said, the only obligation is to actually send it to the Attorney General's office. But I think there'll be a lot of pressure to make it known, and I think there'll be reasons for both sides, just based on, this is me guessing, to want to have the American people judge what is in there as far as these questions of impeachment.
Sure. Dr. Carrington, let me ask you this. I know you and I both share a love for politics and for baseball. Last time you were on, you were very, very close in predicting the World Series and its outcome months out. You are a committed Cincinnati Reds fan. Let me ask you, the Reds made some big offseason moves. How are you feeling for the upcoming season?
Much more positive. Well, I'm always positive, but I think it actually isn't delusional this time. I think they've taken some really good new directions. I really like the new manager. I think they've picked up some great players, some exciting players, and I love Joey Votto. And I'll always be a Reds fan. I'm a fourth generation Reds fan, but I think I've got some reason for hope and you know, hoping the America's game is an enjoyable one for Reds fans this year. I don't believe they'll be in the World Series. I'm not that hopeful, but I'll take a 500+ season. I think that possibly could happen.
There you go, one step at a time.
Right.
Dr. Carrington, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in tonight. That is all the time we have, but tune in again next week as we unpack another issue. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.